Hi, everyone. This is Neha Gupta, founder of College Shortcuts. I'm so glad today I have Jeff Selingo, one of my favorites in the college admissions space. He is the author of Who Gets In and Why, and his latest book coming out, Dream School. These books are must-haves for any parent going through this process. When families are investing so much in their child's education, I have to say, as a college admissions consultant who's been doing this for over 10 years, his books are really, I would say, the best books to read on the admissions process to really get a full feel of what is actually happening behind the admissions curtain. Jeff, welcome on to our show today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Jeff, I've had the honor of getting to not only read your first book, but also get a pre-copy of the second book that's coming out called Dream School, which I think, again, is a must-have for everyone. And so I have some questions for you based on what I've read. One of the things I want to dig into, and for everyone listening, we're going to be digging into different topics around admissions, access, trends, finding your passion in the process, and what that looks like, plus the cost and merit and affordability, and so much more. So, first question I want to ask you is, one of the things you noted in your book is that colleges are beginning to typically reduce their admits from the typical strong feeder schools. So, I'm curious your perspective as we're seeing this shift from the typical feeder schools. How are high achieving students from places like, let's say, San Francisco, New Jersey, Houston, or Northern Virginia kind of approaching this reality? Are they possibly being penalized by going to these top feeder schools or these top private schools?
Well, first of all, no one's penalized for going to a great high school, and I point that out in the book. I want to remind parents that the point of high school is not to get into college. The point
Agreed.
of high school is 4 years of incredible education and maturation and learning about yourself and learning about the topics in high school. And the better high school you go to, that's going to pay off throughout life. It's not just about getting into college. So I think that's the most important thing to remember. I also think that if you were a strong student anywhere at a school that you would want to go to anyway. Because again, if you're a strong student, you're going to want to go to a good high school. And so whether you're in Northern Virginia or you're in Boston or you're in New York or you're in San Francisco, you're going to kind of be treated the same by the college admissions offices. And that's why I think it's critically important to not necessarily downplay your possibilities, not necessarily to think, well, I shouldn't apply there because there's too much competition, or I might not get in because of this high school I go to. But to have a backup plan, to have a plan B, to have a wider lens on the schools that you're applying to. So don't give up on your aspirational choices, but have, and this is really the point of the book, have a broader set of choices available to you so that when decision time comes, and you don't get into that first choice school, you have other choices available to you. And I think that's where parents and students sometimes get upset. Well, like I go to this great school and thus I can't get into Harvard. Well, a lot of kids didn't get into Harvard, but many of them have a plan B, and that's what you need.
Absolutely. And I completely agree. At College Shortcuts, we're very big on building what we call a well-balanced list and to understand that these ultra-selective schools are at the very top of your list, and that's fine at the ultra-selective side, but having good targets and safeties are very important as well. Based on the data that you've reviewed, how much does geographic diversity play into the admissions process?
So it cuts both ways. I think at the more selective schools, it is critically important to them. Most selective schools want to have geographic diversity. They want to say they have students from all 50 states and X number of countries. Less selective schools know that yield matters too. So does yield matter, obviously, at highly selective schools, but yield matters, and they know that they have a better shot of getting students closer to home. They're going to yield those students more. They're more likely to yield those students, meaning the students they accept are more likely to enroll the closer they live to campus. So geography. So while these less selective colleges want geographic diversity, for the most part, what they really end up focusing on is yield, and they know that kids in their backyard are going to yield at a higher rate.
Absolutely. And at the beginning of your book, in the first around like mid 50 pages of the book, you mentioned that today, unfortunately, students aren't really using college to explore anymore. In a lot of ways, it's become very specific. And I will say that it's really interesting because we see that when I look at college admissions 10, 12 years ago, this was a time when people would be going to college undecided, taking their time to explore, try different classes. And now today, I'm seeing as a college consultant the exact opposite. It's almost like colleges are wanting to know exactly what you're passionate about, what is your spike, what is your defined major. And I'd like to have maybe a more open conversation around, is this pressure to specialize before 18 really rational? And is it in a response of the fact that college costs have gotten so high, so parents are saying, "Hey, please make sure to try to figure this out early." That's one aspect. Or is it because of the competition in the admissions process? Um, from our perspective, we do really feel it is that loss of academic freedom and intellectual curiosity happening in this process. So I'd love to hear your personal take on this change that has clearly been happening over the last 10 years.
Yeah, and it's definitely happening. I think it's a combination of all of the above. I think that students, especially since the Great Recession of 2008, and this is well documented, that they have looked to college for a job. And so the ROI of a degree has played a much bigger role in not only college choice, but major choice. So they're really looking at that ROI of a degree. That's why we've had a flight away from the humanities and towards STEM degrees. STEM degrees are sometimes typically more expensive for colleges to offer. They're not as big in terms of a major. And so what then ends up happening is that students, colleges have to kind of limit the number of majors in those, they're capacity controlled. And when they're capacity controlled, that means in the admissions process, they need to tell students, well, if you want to apply to engineering or computer science, you have to tell us like now, because we have to know how many students we're going to admit into this. And you can't just get in here, decide later on that's what you're going to major in and as a result transfer there. So that doesn't happen very often. So I think it's a combination of both colleges wanting that certainty on enrollment and parents and students wanting that ROI. Now, what's interesting in Dream School, I talk about this research among in the UK, among the Scots and among the British on specialization and when do you pick that specialization. And what they found in this study is that students who chose a specialization early on kind of come out of the gate more quickly. In other words, they get a great first job, they get a great salary, but then they tend to hit a peak pretty quickly and tend to kind of even out. Whereas if you wait to decide on a specialization, you kind of check out a bunch of different ideas and majors, and maybe you intern at a bunch of different places. You might not come out of the gate immediately, but that you then you end up making more money over the course of your lifetime. So they liken it almost to like marrying the first person you meet, as opposed to like kind of dating a lot and trying to figure out who your best match is. Same thing with careers and jobs. And so I'm really an advocate for waiting, but I understand why parents don't do it.
So I'm curious, one of the things that I've done, at least in helping students to figure out what they're interested in, because one of the things that I see a lot is when students are asked possibly, "Hey, what are you possibly interested in high school?" A lot of times they say, "I don't know." And rightfully so. Our education system isn't really built to be like, "Oh, I'm taking science and therefore I want to do XYZ major or job." But what I've done is I've built these experiences for students to do research papers or internships or find summer programs that are related to maybe what they're interested in and get that exposure early on. And I'm curious if you feel that if a student in those high school years, and yes, they go to college, maybe they've selected that major, and maybe they do change that major because we know that happens often. Um, but at least they're taking a little bit more time early in the process of test driving things.
Yeah, and I think that's critically important. And even if you have to pick a major early on, it doesn't stop you from picking up some minors or
Yes.
picking classes outside of your major. It doesn't stop you from joining clubs that might be outside of your major. It doesn't stop you from thinking about internships or job shadowing or talking to people about jobs that your major could lead to or that other majors could lead to. And remember, a third of students change majors at least once during their undergraduate years. It's not uncommon for
Right.
students to come home and change majors, particularly that first year of college. So I don't think that major is determinative. And a lot of people will debate this, like, does your major determine your job? In some cases, it does, right? If you're an engineering major or a nursing major or something like that. But in other places, like psychology, I think psychology is a great major if you're going to go into advertising or marketing. Other people will say, well, you have to major in marketing as an undergraduate business degree. I, I think that if you no matter what you major in, as long as you get the skills that are needed in the marketplace, and as long as you get those internships that are critical for life after college, I think all of those things matter just as much as the college major. And I know that's a hot take, but it's true.
Completely agree. Actually, I was listening to one of your other interviews where you were also sharing, for example, around the psychology and advertising, that if most people actually took a look at marketing, it's not what it was 15 years ago. Today, like you were saying, it is data driven. So having a data background or being open and okay with numbers when you are focused on marketing can make all the difference. The other touch you're talking about there as well on the different skills. I know that I think both of us are very passionate about it's not just the major and it's not just about going to college, it's also about the soft skills that you develop, the executive functioning skills, the proactive nature. And I do think that it's extremely important in the process to learn that as you are maturing through college. Um, One of the things that I've noticed, at least in the admissions process, especially with, I would say, more of our high achieving students that are very specific about their GPAs and APs and scores. And a lot of times I try to tell them, look, there's tons of kids that have perfect GPAs and scores. What else is there that matters to you? Um, so many students today are now treating the college admissions process almost very much like a performative, perfectionist kind of attitude towards it. What would you say is the risk of these students that are kind of in this always on perfect mindset later on in the process?
Well, I think what they end up discovering, as many of the students I talked to in my book ended up discovering when they got to college, is that that performative process doesn't end when you get to college. I think many students think, well, I'm jumping through these hoops and that's going to end. And what I heard from students in the book is that they get to, especially these more selective colleges, where they might not be exactly happy because what ends up happening is they have to get into line to get into a club. There's a waiting list for a course. There's all this competition. And by the way, now the competition has been heightened because you're now not only competing against the people in your neighborhood or in your town who would have gone to your high school, but now you're competing against the top students from all over the place. And you tend to that tends to wash some students out, tends to lead to why many students stop out of college or end up transferring. And there is kind of an unhappiness with these students as a result.
Yeah. And one of the things as well that, I had questions about as I read your book, is you had shared that, in at some of these ultra selective schools, they have on-campus recruiting. And in that on-campus recruiting, the elite schools tend to have really great opportunities for their students. But your data and the information that you show is that actually it's not just the ultra selective schools that have these opportunities, that other schools do as well. And from what I've seen on the college admissions side, from a consultant perspective and parents, their perspective is that if they get into an ultra elite school, that typically those have better jobs or better opportunities. You also mentioned a little bit about lottery tickets. Can you expand on this topic? Because I think this is something that many parents are curious about in that experience of going to college, getting recruited, and getting a job.
So the idea of the lottery ticket comes from David Deming, who I interviewed for the book, and David Deming works with Raj Chetty on opportunity insights. It's all the data that you've seen in the news, that your listeners have seen in the news over the years about who goes to elite colleges, particularly the Ivy League, and what happens afterwards. And so they got access to not only admissions records, but also IRS data in the aggregate afterwards to really find out what is the value of a going to a top college. And one of the things that they found was that does it help in getting a job afterwards? Certainly. But as David described it to me, is that it's like 10 of us were in a room and we each got one lottery ticket, and the person who went to the Ivy League school got two lottery tickets. And so it's a better chance. But everyone else has if there's a room of 10, one person has a 2 in 10 chance of winning, everybody else has that 1 in 10 chance of winning. And so as a result, the thing is that it also depends on what you end up doing in college. And so if you go to a less selective college or you're not at one of those top ranked universities, as long as you have those experiences that lead to the job market, that's in the end what counts. In other words, there are students who go to Harvard who are underemployed and unemployed as well. And so it's not only where you go, obviously helps a little bit according to this research, but it's what you do while you're there. And if you go to a less selective college, many of whom I interviewed in the book ended up going to great uh, graduate schools, but also great jobs as well.
Absolutely. And let's talk a little bit about that. I do believe that, yes, you can get into a great school, but you were sharing that, sometimes you can still go to a Harvard and still be underemployed. What do you think it is based on your data and research and what you've done? Because you've interviewed so many families and everyone really in the space. From your perspective, what do you think it is outside of getting into college that really a student who may have had the chops to get into those schools, but while they're in there are maybe floundering or maybe they're not getting the opportunities. What is it that causes that?
So a lot of it is what I mentioned earlier, is that they get into a small sea of, and as I describe in the book, you could be a big fish in a small sea at a less selective institution. You can also be at a more selective institution. This could be kind of a smaller sea, but you're going to have a lot more fish in it. You could have a lot more sharks in it. Students tend to be, they come to these places, the Harvards of the world, the Yales of the world, from all over the world. And suddenly now you're surrounded by these best students. And some students kind of rise to that challenge and they like the competition and it pushes them further. Other students, though, are kind of surprised by it and they pull back. And they're no longer the smartest kid in the class like they were in high
Yes.
school. And in fact, there's again research here that shows, particularly in STEM fields, that you're better off, for every increase in the SAT score, in your SAT score, the more selective college is, that your chances of actually dropping out increase as well, dropping out of that major. And so, in other words, when you go to a college where everybody has scored a 1500 or 1600 on the SAT, most parents think, well, again, my kid will just rise to the challenge. And what ends up happening is the competition kind of washes them out and they end up not doing as well as they expected in that major. They end up dropping out of that major. And in some cases, they end up leaving that school and transferring other places. Compare that with one of the students I met in the book in chapter 2, who went to a small liberal arts college, not even in the top 100, where she, met professors who spent time with her. She knew the college president. They helped her with fellowship applications. She ends up going to Harvard Law School, ends up being on the Harvard Law Review from this school. And it just shows that maybe without competition, it actually helps you thrive because you're able to be that big fish in a small sea. People notice you and help you.
Yes. And I agree with you. I mean, I remember I went to Rice University in Houston, Texas, and I remember realizing that I was not the smartest kid anymore. And it was hard. I went to Episcopal High School, which was one of the top private schools in Houston. I was at the top. My sister went to St. John's and I saw how much she struggled academically to try to even be near the top. So I said, I'm not going there. I want to do extracurriculars. I want to dance, do art, do other things, and be good in high school. But man, when I walked onto that campus, I realized I just was not the smartest kid. I was around other students that were way smarter than me in terms of the speed at which they could study, the way they could think. And it really, I still miss those days of the types of conversations we had in the cafeterias together. Um, and you're right, Rice, when I got to the higher up classes closer to my last 2 years, I was in classes with 12 to 15 people. Malcolm Gillis was one of our teachers who was the past president. I actually knew the president at that time too. And so I agree with you. I think that it really does matter. I also had experience at UT Austin, where I did Plan 2, but for some of my
Right.
regular classes, I was floored going from a small private school to a classroom of 500 students and only being able to talk to the TA. I thought it was kind of odd to me. And so I agree with you. I think that college fit really does matter, whether it's selective, ultra selective, not as selective. But really, I love how you talked about in the book that you should look at the types of classes. You should look at the class ratio. Don't just walk on campus. Try to get more of a sense of this school. Because I think it is very important when you're selecting a school to find the right fit. Um, the other thing I want to talk about is a little bit around um, the cost aspect of college, because I mean, I'm amazed when I look at what Rice cost when I went, and I've got some gray hairs, Jeff, so it's been a while. But when I think back to then versus today, I'm kind of floored at the price change. And so I know that, you share in the book that sometimes people on the admissions side or in general have shared like full pay students are considered gold in this process. And I do share with our families that college is a business and you have to think about it from that perspective as well. As these sticker prices are raising, sometimes the merit aid is shrinking for these upper middle class families. Um, what are your perspectives, and can you share a little bit from what you saw from the book around the admissions process and the cost and affordability of college?
So it's clear to me two things are happening. One is we know from the data that increasingly, even students at higher income levels are struggling to pay for the net price of college. The net price of college has gone up for everybody. What do I mean by the net price of college? That's actually the real price you pay. We all know that for the most part, not everybody pays the sticker price. So what's the real price that people are paying after financial aid? And we know that at every income level, all up the income scale, the net price of college has grown. And that's particularly problematic. People don't necessarily feel sorry for these people, but it's particularly problematic for people who make $200,000, $250,000 a year family income plus, right? These are people that, for the most part, somebody at that salary level, adjusted for inflation over the last 30 or 40 years, has largely paid full price at both public and private colleges. But when a private college starts being 70, 80, 90,000 all in for sticker price, there's only so many people, a lot fewer people who can pay that sticker price. Now, some people are, what I found in the book is that looking at both the survey I took of 3,000 parents, but also looking at surveys that Ipsos and Sally May take over, is that parents are starting to think differently about, is that really money I want to spend, even if I can? So do I want to pay $80,000 a year? Now, you might want to pay it for prestige. And so what we're seeing is that parents are willing to pay for a certain amount of prestige. But that prestige bucket is shrinking. And what do I mean by that? There used to be 50 colleges in that prestige bucket. Now there's 30. Pretty soon there might be 25. Pretty soon they might only be able to, they only really want to pay full sticker price for like 10 universities. And we could all name them, off the top of our head. So what happens then is those full pay parents are skipping over all those other places that 20 years ago they would have easily paid for full price. And now they are looking for a combination of prestige and money, meaning merit aid. So they're starting to go to honors colleges at public universities, or they're going to private colleges a little further in the rankings that still are considered prestigious by a lot of people, but are willing to give them some merit aid. And that to me is the big difference now compared to even 10 years ago.
Yes, and I've seen that with our students as well, where if their state school's offering a lot more or a different school's offering a lot more, they'll take the deal. And rightfully so, actually. While I do help a lot of students in this process, many want to go to these top schools. When the offers all come in at the end, and they've got two or three children, I say, look, plan ahead. right? Because you can't assume these prices are all going to be the same. I'm curious your perspective on, let's say there's a family in Texas, right? We've obviously UT Austin when back in the day it used to be top 10% auto admit. Now it's at top 6%. They're expecting to drop that even more. So UT Austin has definitely changed in terms of their admissions rates of auto acceptance. But let's say you have a student that's not in the top 10% or even the top 6%, and maybe they're an average student. Um, it's gotten so hard for them, not only for what was typically a state school that accepted a lot more students, and then now ultra selective is completely out of the picture. What are your thoughts for that student? You talk a lot in your book about creating the new dream school list. So, can you touch a little bit on that? Because you talk also about how there was someone at a high school and asking them to raise their hands, and visually, it was written so well, Jeff. Visually, you can see it where, like, all of a sudden, no parents have their hands up because they could only name the top 20 or 50 colleges in the process. So, can you share a little bit more to that shift in perspective around the dream school?
So I really want to give parents permission to think more broadly about the colleges on their list, right? Tend to know the colleges that everybody at our high school goes to every year. And there's another story in the book that I particularly like of a high school counselor who, working with juniors, asked them to go research schools, but they can't research any schools that somebody in the senior class the previous couple of years has gone to. So they give them a list. Here's all the schools where our seniors have enrolled in. You can't research any of these schools, which, by the way, tends to be most of the top ranked schools. And so they have to go off and research these other schools. And then they present them both to their parents and to their peers. But when presenting them, they don't tell them the name of the school. They kind of
Right.
hide the name, and they're talking about all these great things, and then they reveal the name, and the parents are like, "Oh, that would have been a great place, but nah, I don't really want you to go to fill in the blank college." And I think it really shows, particularly parents, how they are so enamored, so attached to that brand name. And really, the message of this new book is I want to give parents permission to think more broadly. And the way I do that is by giving them the tools to discover these colleges that are deeper in the list or in some ranking, but have great outcomes, have a great sense of belonging, help students get the skills that they need to succeed in the workforce. That to me is the most important part of this book.
I think it's the most important part of the college admissions process. I think the thing that a lot of parents are battling, specifically, and I know I serve a lot of families where they moved to the US, they had children here, and their goal was to give their children an education that was something they didn't have the opportunity for. Um, and so, from what I've noticed, it's not always just about the parent and their focus on prestige, and you beautifully touch on it in the book, which I'm amazed you went there because not everyone has the guts to do that. But you talk about how sometimes it really is about what other people think. And
Well, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, and I'd like for you to just kind of expand a little bit on that research because it is definitely, while parents will not say that to me directly, I can feel there's an undercurrent. If someone is saying Stanford or bust, Ivy or bust, and I've even heard of, unfortunately, within some of my extended family, a student got into Johns Hopkins and the family was like, you should transfer later. It still wasn't XYZ. And I mean, it breaks my heart because I've known this child for a long time and they did a phenomenal job in the process. And Johns Hopkins is a phenomenal school. Um, but this insane amount of pressure of name brand, but really in the end, to be able to tell their friends at a dinner party.
Well, and I think has a lot to do with it. I mentioned earlier that I did a survey of 3,000 parents for this book. Only 16% of them said it was important to them that their children attend a prestigious college. Then they were asked, how
Hmm.
important is it to their children? 27% said it was important to their children. So 16% to them, 27% to their children. But then this is really, really got interesting. Then they were asked how they thought others in their community would choose. And 61% thought prestige was important to other parents. So we're okay with wherever our kid goes, but every other parent wants their kids to go to a prestigious school. What this really says to me is that so do even the parents who that 16%, right? It really is important to them because it's most important to how they're perceived in the community, how they, put those stickers on the back of their car, how they
Yes.
tell parents at PTA meetings and parties, right? Where they're not kind of mumbling the name of the college that their kid is going to because they're kind of embarrassed by it. And
Right.
that's what I want to change about this book. I want this book to arm parents with students with the information to make a broader set of choices that they're loud and proud of talking about. That we shouldn't have to mumble where our kid is going to college because we're so proud of where they're going.
Yes, and I also think again, it's college, it's not everything. Right? There's so much more that can happen in life outside of those 4 years. Um, so one of the big questions I get a lot from families, and I know you've probably heard this many times because it is the hot question, is with the rapid developments in artificial intelligence, how should families and students really be thinking about career planning post-college? How do we future-proof these college students in a world where job roles may not exist yet?
I think it's hard. We don't know so much right now about what artificial intelligence is going to do. I do think that being occupationally footloose, um, being more flexible in what you learn and how you learn is going to be more important. So we talked earlier about picking a specific major. Well, if you pick that specific major, make sure you have other skills. And what are those other skills? Human skills, we heard this over and over again, are critically important. What are human skills? The ability to communicate, the ability to write, the ability to work in teams, the ability to problem solve. Creativity is going to become incredibly more important, in my opinion, given what's happening with artificial intelligence. So, all of this is going to be important going forward to not be just so focused on one career or on one major, but to have a set of skills that allow you to kind of work in concert, to work in partnership, to work complementary to AI.
Absolutely. And, for families that are really kind of thinking through this investment, right? I know a lot of parents, when they're spending so much on a school, it's sometimes for many people the second largest investment they do after buying a house. So, for these families that are thinking about that, is there a centralized, reliable source for these post college employment stats, possibly by major or by school, to see and understand? Maybe even more granular around salary or types of jobs. I know you touch a little bit on it in the book itself around, the jobs after college and you did get some data of that nature. Is there a way for parents to access something like that on their own?
Yeah, so I think the best source of this is the College Scorecard, which is a federal government website, so you can easily find it. You can see salaries a couple of years out of college by major, if they have, as long as they have enough students in the major, and by college. So you could compare, if you're going to be a math major, you could compare being a math major at X institution versus Y institution. So a great resource because what you're also going to see, by the way, is that major sometimes matters more than school. So if you're going to major in something that's going to pay a lot of money, or even an English major at some of these places, which by the way doesn't pay as much money, at least out the door, there's a lot of overlap between more selective schools and less selective schools. Especially so, for example, I'll just take computer science at the University of Illinois, at Loyola University of Maryland, at Duke University. You're going to find pretty similar salaries at those three institutions, which, by the way, are very different places.
Right. And and I want to also just touch on like everything does not boil down obviously to salary, right? Everybody like it also the point of college is to explore and also find happiness and all sorts of other aspects. And I do think that having that data is important, but also figuring out what your child's strengths are and what they truly love to help them explore that in college is important. One of the things I noticed, especially at Rice, and especially during the recruiting fairs, is I had an interview at Goldman Sachs and I got the internship and then they offered me a full-time job after. And that was around my second or third year of college. And so the thing I was curious about was if college is supposed to be a place where you're supposed to technically take the time to figure out your major and explore. And I remember my senior year, I took an art history and religion course, and I realized totally picked the wrong major in my mind because the professor was incredible, and I'd always loved art when I was younger. And I wish I had allowed myself to take those classes a bit earlier in those electives. I was very focused on graduating quickly out of college at that time, which now that I look back, should have stayed in way longer. Um, but my curiosity is in today's world where, they're wanting you to pick the major in the admissions process, and then by second year you're getting offered internships, and let's say you're going possibly into finance and you don't take those internships, then you do lose those spots in that recruiting process. So I guess it feels a bit confusing in the process for how is a student that's a teenager able to go to college, take their time, still not be sure what they want to do, and not miss out on these opportunities for these job offers that these companies are trying to snatch the smartest, brightest out of those schools. And tell me, Jeff, if the question is unreasonable, because I can't figure out if,
It's not unreasonable. You will, there's certain things you are going to miss out on. There is based on where you go to college, based on your major, based on when you pick your major. I guess the key is that not launching out of college is incredibly important, but being at Goldman Sachs, being at Microsoft, being at Amazon is not the end all be all. Not everybody works there. And many of those students end up kind of being unhappy there and move on anyway. But there's only, it's like any other competition in life. Some students are going to get these jobs, some students aren't. Some students get these jobs because of where they go and what they major in. Excuse me. So it's not an unreasonable question, but there's only so much that's in your control.
agreed. And I will share with everyone, a lot of people are surprised when I say this, but I actually had a mentor at Goldman Sachs who had said, Neha, you can always come back to this, but from our perspective, private wealth management, while you can do it, and we're going to give you the offer, you can always come back. It seems like there's more to your life and what you could do. And I had multiple people say that to me in different amazing jobs I had at Coach Handbags in the corporate office to Goldman Sachs. So large organizations only to find and realize that entrepreneurship was really, in the end, what my passion was. So I do think you're right. And one of your other interviews, you also share and talk with a panel about how, the job the job process and the entire career process is not linear. Can you expand a little bit more to parents that today's generation is not, for example, getting a job at Exxon for 20 years? And I think that a lot of families think that that first job is the most important offer they will ever get. Can you expand a little bit about how careers actually in today's world with this generation that it may shift and change? They're not going to stay at a company forever.
No, and in fact, in many ways, I think I mentioned earlier that you want to be kind of occupationally footloose and job footloose, especially in those first couple of years out of college, first 10 years out of college. The more you learn, the more you move, the better off you're going to be. Job hopping is actually kind of a feature now, not a bug, for students. And that's particularly true if you're not in a place like a Goldman Sachs where they have a specific, runway to move through the organization where you're learning kind of a rotational type of thing, which is, a feature of many bigger companies. But the more that you're able to learn in those first 10 years in the job, going to be much more critical to your career later on. And I think that many of today's parents were kind of taught not to move jobs, right? To stay in an industry, to stay with a company. I actually think it's better now from a learning process because the number of skills that you need to know are just churning at an ever faster rate. And the more you're able to move around and learn those skills from different organizations, the better off you're going to be.
Absolutely. And then, from your perspective, do you think that colleges should be required to publicly disclose their graduate employment, salary data, and all that information, just like they do, in the other processes of sharing their information on, different areas? I'm curious about how, if a family is deciding, and I see this question come on different standpoints. They'll say, okay, I want to know if we go to this high school, what are the graduates typically going to and how many, right? Like that data is very important if we're focusing on prestige specifically. The second question then is, okay, if we're selecting these colleges, what is typically that information? Do you think that colleges each should be able to provide that data very easily to families, possibly on their website or somewhere of their alumni information?
I think the more transparent that they could be, the more important, the more good, the better it is for families and students making decisions. I think they have every right to know where have students in my major, where have they interned last year, this year? How many intern spots did they get? Where have the job offers been? Where have they accepted jobs? What are those jobs like? How do they transition through jobs? The more information that you have about the career outcomes of college, the more critical it's going to be for in terms of making the decision because parents and students, as I said earlier, especially after the Great Recession, the number one reason to go to college is for a job. They want to know what you're doing. And that's going to be critically important that that colleges are able to provide that. And if colleges can't, if you're a parent on a tour, if you ask these questions and they can't answer them or they hedge, it's a red flag to me. Maybe they don't know, but if they don't know, that means they're also not really trying.
They're not
I actually would rather give them a pass on maybe the results aren't that great. The economy is not great everywhere. We talked about AI perhaps disrupting, especially entry level jobs. I would rather see so-so outcomes than no outcomes.
agreed. And I do think that if colleges, especially whether it's ultra selective or the not so ultra selective, if the not so ultra selective are able to provide such clear data, I think that's an insane selling point. And Jeff, can you also talk a little bit about, and I know this is in who gets in and why, but can you talk a little bit about the buyers and sellers list around the college process?
Yes. This is a list that I developed for Who Gets In and Why, which was my last book. And basically, it's a shorthand to try to determine. We were talking earlier about merit aid, particularly getting merit aid at more selective places. The most selective places are sellers. They don't really give out any merit aid at all, or they give out merit aid to the most exceptional students. Most of their aid budget goes to purely financial needy students. But most colleges are buyers. It doesn't mean that their academics are any worse off than any other college. In fact, they actually might give a superior experience. But to be a buyer means you just need to fill your seats, and thus you need to give out merit aid in order to attract them. As I always describe it, it's a coupon that is like a Macy's coupon to get you in the store. Macy's knows if they give you a 10%, 25% coupon, you're going to come in the store and you're going to spend more money. And so over time, that will essentially pay for itself. Colleges would rather give parents 10, 20, $30,000 in scholarships and have them bring some money to the table, the rest of tuition, than them to say, well, we can't afford anything, so we're not going to come at all. They would have an empty seat rather than a seat that is discounted because they're at least bringing some money in the door. And this is important to know because I think many parents, when I talk to them, are kind of blown away by the idea of merit aid. They hear merit and they think, oh, well, that only goes to the very top students. Merit aid is really a strategy, a financial leveraging strategy. And for most of today's parents, merit aid was around, but it wasn't as used as much as it is today. And so they feel, well, to get financial aid, I have to qualify for it. I have to be financially needy. And that's not the case anymore.
Absolutely. And I'll say in 2025, we saw quite an interesting admissions process, especially around decisions. Jeff, I know you worked on an article around the recent issues with Syracuse and their admissions process and what they were doing in order to fill seats. Can you share a little bit to what is going on from the early decision, early action, regular decision to people were changing their deposits pretty late in the game, wait lists were changing, and what is your perspective on how that's going to look in the next 2 to 5 years?
Well,
Because
I
we
think it's
are
yeah, it's
floored.
only going to get worse. There's no doubt about it because what's happening now is that the prices have become outlandish at some colleges. On top of that, we have smaller high school graduating classes. Given what's happening right now in higher ed, we may have fewer international students coming to the U.S. So the competition for domestic student in the US is only going to grow. And what that does that mean? That means these coupons I was talking about earlier are just going to proliferate even more. Syracuse being a great example this year. I think we're going to see a lot more of this, but earlier in the process. So what Syracuse did is after May 1st, they contacted students who had applied, were accepted, but decided not to come, or maybe they never even told them they weren't coming. These students had already committed to other schools, and Syracuse said, okay, we're going to give you 10, 20, 20 $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. They just started throwing money at these students to switch their enrollment from another school to come to Syracuse. I think we're going to see a lot more of that, but probably, by the way,
Oof.
much earlier in the process. I think we're just going to see schools throwing money earlier in the process to try to get students to commit earlier in the process.
It's going to be very interesting because I remember the days where you put your deposit down and that was it. You were committed, that was your decision. And if it's fascinating to see the amount of students that were waitlisted last year and how many are just waiting. And it's still July, even though they've committed elsewhere. Um, Jeff, I'd love to know if you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience around Dream School. And again, when this book comes out, every single parent needs to buy this book. Anything that Jeff writes, I have to tell you, if you are a parent that's going to be investing a lot in your child's education and you want to get the quick information you need in barely less than 300 pages, these are the books to buy. So, Jeff, can you share a little bit about what you want to share as maybe a last word around Dream School and in general, the perspective around college admissions, especially with the level of research and data you've committed your life to towards this space?
Well, I think if you read Who Gets In and Why, it was about how colleges make decisions about choosing students from inside the admissions office. This book is about how students and families make decisions and choose colleges, and why, in my opinion, with a lot of data backing it up, they should broaden that lens on the number of colleges they're looking at. It doesn't mean that they should stop aiming for a top ranked college, but it, I think, gives a dose of reality about how difficult it is to get into some of those places and how there's a lot of myths surrounding the success of students at those places. My goal with this book is to try to change mindsets about the college search process so that we look more broadly on it and then give you the tools to help you make the right choices. I'm trying to change minds. I think what Who Gets In and Why did was give that dose of reality to parents who said, wow, it's really hard to get into some of these places. I think this book really helps them now figure out what do we do next. So really excited to get this into hands of parents.
Yes, it should be in every high school parent's hands. So, Jeff, thank you so much for your time and energy and the amount of incredible work that you do in our space. I know every independent educational consultant is so grateful to you for the work that you do. So many of us are uh, so excited to have this book come out because we do think that you are creating the space for the demystification of the process. You're creating the conversation around the admissions process that not every counselor has time to do. And I think you're going to change a lot of minds and lives in this process. So thank you so much for being on our show. And we can't wait for the book to come out.
I hope so. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.